Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and also for joining us yesterday. For those who are joining us for the very first time, my name is Asiphem Khalisa, and I work at the Center for Postgraduate Studies. And today we are having a workshop on being an ethical researcher. And today we are having Professor Sue McKenna from the center who will be taking us through this session today. But just before giving over to Sue, please make sure that your mic and your video is always off at all times, unless it is time for engagements, which will be indicated by the facilitator. Secondly, we are live streaming this conversation, so do follow us on our YouTube channel by typing the Center for Postgraduate Studies, and you will see it will show immediately. We also have other recordings in there. So this session, if you need a recording for this session, it will be available on YouTube after the live stream. Again, we will be posting an evaluation link on the chats. Please do assist us by evaluating this workshop as well as other engagements that we have at the center. Without wasting any time, we only have 1 hour today. I will now hand over to Sue to begin with this workshop. Over to you, Sue. Thank you very much for facilitating.
Thanks, Asipe. Thank you for those kind words. To anyone who's with us today, who was with us yesterday, I apologize that you're getting to hear from me 2 days in a row. But as Asipe said, today's session is only an hour, and I'm hoping that it'll be fairly interactive, so you won't be only listening to my voice throughout. As Asipe has indicated, this is one of a series of workshops. CPGS runs workshops throughout the year, but this one is in particular part of the orientation program for all postgraduate students. Even if you've been here for a few years, you're still welcome to do it again. It's on RU Connected, and Olwetu will put the link into the chat at some point, and you can click on that and self-register. There's loads of useful materials that I urge all of you to spend some time going through. So today we're talking all things ethics. And I just want to make a few comments before I do open it up to everyone who's here to get your input and your questions. And one of the things I want to point out is that there's often a confusion between ethics and ethical clearance. So when I hear students or even academics saying, something about ethics, they're actually not referring to doing ethical research or being ethical researchers. They're often referring to the administrative requirement to get ethical clearance to collect data. Now, that administrative requirement shouldn't just be a compliance bureaucratic process. It should really enable you, when you fill in the form on ERIS, to think through the ethical issues pertaining to your course. But of course, once you've got ethical clearance, ethical issues may well emerge that you couldn't have thought about. And so it's really important to think about ethics as being more than the process you have to do to collect data. It's really much more than that. It's really at the heart of why we do research and what research is for. Because ethics is about behaving in ways that are going to do the least harm and going to provide the most good. And that really is an identity issue. That really is thinking about yourself as a researcher and what you hope to do with your research and what you hope the research will be to benefit your discipline, to benefit the planet, to benefit all people. So it really goes beyond ethical clearance. We will have another session on the use of ERIS, so a very practical session where we actually take you through the ERIS system, and that will be coming up soon. I will not be talking about the ethical clearance process. I'll be talking about the kinds of reflections that you need to engage in when you consider what kind of researcher you want to be. And of course, we assume you want to be an ethical one. It's important to note that the rise of ethical clearance as a bureaucratic requirement has come about not just because we have more and more bureaucracy, more and more forms in the university, but also because there have been some absolutely shocking instances of research that have been done around the world and in South Africa, which have had embedded in them all sorts of injustices and atrocities. Many of these are historical, but some of them continue now. So we can look at some of the issues around drug testing in vulnerable populations, which is not uncommon, where global north pharmaceutical companies will often test their drugs in perhaps more vulnerable populations who may be more willing to take a payment to participate in such studies. These are the kinds of issues and many, many more. There's another workshop on ethical case studies that we can do later in the year. But just to note that this rise of ethical clearance is to try and give us an opportunity before we collect our data to think about the ethical implications of our studies. We've got a whole host of codes and policies around the world around ethics. These are just a few of them. That first one, the Nuremberg Code, was really the first big ethical code for researchers, and it emerged out of the Nuremberg trials, which followed the Second World War and the Holocaust in Germany, because it was found that in many of the German the Nazi camps, there were medical experiments being done on prisoners who were then killed or who died because of the medical experiments. Now, these experiments, I have to say, actually led to a huge breakthrough in understanding of all sorts of medical issues at the incredibly enormous cost of human dignity and human lives. And so this was the real point at which, as a research community internationally, we said, hang on, we must have some baseline agreements about what constitutes ethical behavior in research. And out of that, we've now got a whole wealth of codes, which all get interpreted in different ways and end up being our ethical clearance processes within our university. Most of these codes have a strong medical focus. Most of the original codes about research came to regulate the way in which medical research was undertaken. And a lot of these codes also have assumptions about that research is typically natural science-based, is typically quantitative, is typically attempts to be fairly objective. And all of these things will not hold true across the whole range of research undertaken. So a common criticism of both these codes and of ethical clearance processes is that the questions that are asked of researchers and the documents that are required of researchers assumes medical research and or other forms of natural science research, and therefore are often irrelevant or problematic for research in, say, commerce, humanities, or other social sciences. And certainly, I think that this is the case in South Africa because the ethical clearance process is monitored and managed at a national level, and every university has to get audited by this national body in order to have permission to grant ethical clearance to our staff members and students doing research. But this is not undertaken by the Department of Higher Education and Training. It's undertaken by the Department of Health. So regardless of what research our staff members and students do, regardless of what field, what the topic is, what the methodology is, it will always be audited and overseen by the Department of Health. And this is problematic in many ways because the understanding of many of these people will be of a particular form of research. Having said that, I do think that there is a better understanding of why this is a problem, and there's more openness to understanding the range of research and the range of specific ethical issues that are raised by different forms of research. And I must really commend the ethical committees at Rhodes University, who I think have engaged with these concerns quite rigorously. So we now have sort of different streams on ERAS, which you will learn about when you do the ERAS workshop. We have different streams for research using animals, research, human research, educational research has its own stream. And this allows not only to have more appropriate questions in the ethical clearance process, but it also ensures that the reviewers are more likely to understand the research that you're doing and the ethical implications of that. So in the end, I really hope that what we can have as an institution is awareness of ethics and the need to be ethical and to have deep reflection on ethical issues, and not just to see ethics as being, oh, it's ethical clearance, it's a bureaucratic process, tell them what they want, get the go ahead, done, tick, move on. But that rather we use that process of getting ethical clearance as a space to have conversations with fellow researchers, with our supervisors, to think through what are the specific ethical issues in your study and how will you manage them. And then to keep that awareness throughout your study so that you're constantly reflecting, am I being ethical? Am I behaving in ethical ways? It is a great concern to me, for example, that many of the publications that we see in our academic journals are increasingly being retracted. So if you follow a group called Retraction Watch, you'll find them on Facebook, but you can also just Google them. They map how many times academic articles are being withdrawn after they've been published and presumably read and cited. So they're already out there having impact on the world of sciences, all forms of science. And then it's found out that there's a problem with them. And oftentimes the problem is around forged data, tampering with data, or the fact that the research was undertaken without the proper ethical clearance. So this suggests to me that as we move into an era of publish or perish, you've got to publish all the time, it's possible that we have researchers who are more focused on the publication than on the identity of being an ethical researcher and the responsibility of producing ethical research. So I really hope that everyone in the university community sees ethics as being much more than a compliance issue, but rather as being fundamental to your identity as a researcher. So as I said, most of these ethical clearance codes came originally from the medical field, and some of the 4 principles may be completely relevant to your study. Let's go through them. The 4 principles of medical ethics are autonomy, which is where, and you can see the word patient because it's medical research, but where you respect the patient's right to self-determination. And in the case of many other forms of research, it would be the subject's right or the participant's right to self-determination. In other words, are they fully informed? They can't give consent to something. So consent is very important, that they willingly participate, but they can't willingly participate in something they haven't fully understood. So informed consent comes in there. And that's where both of those words are important, informed and consent. And again, I often see informed consent forms that look more like legal documents. They're full of jargon. They're very alienating, I would say, to the average person who has to sign them. They look very much in terms of format and language like legal. They're full of complicated words. And that for me is very problematic because that's not fully informed. You must use the language that will make sense to your participants. Sometimes a written document is not appropriate. So don't just think of informed consent as something tick, I've done, but rather think, well, what would it look like to ensure genuine autonomy, genuine freedom of whoever's involved in my research if you are indeed using living creatures, be they animals or humans. So what does that look like in your field, that idea of autonomy? Another principle of medical ethics is this idea of beneficence, which basically means do good. Is your research going to do good? It can't just be, well, it'll get me a qualification. It needs to contribute to the field, contribute to the conversation. It might really produce knowledge that takes the whole field forward, that is immediately implementable, that makes a huge difference in people's lives. But to be honest, most postgraduate research doesn't do this. It's very rare for postgraduate research to change the field, to make a huge change in the lives of communities or in particular professions. I'm not saying yours won't. Indeed, it'll be fantastic if it does, but that's not what you have to. You don't have to try to get a Nobel Prize. You just have to try to get your honors, your master's, or your doctorate, which means you make a contribution to the field. And that beneficence, that doing good, might be very small, but that's how knowledge is made, in small incremental bits. So does your research do good? Does it have a rationale, a purpose, which you can say is good for people and for the planet? It is true that, in fact, many of our studies do not do good. So the opposite, or the counterpart, the other side of the coin of beneficence, is non-maleficence. So it must do good, or at the very least, it must not do bad. And often research actually does have some potentially bad implications. And that, again, in the ethical clearance process, think through what are the potential harms that might be done to your participants, to the environment, and how can you mitigate them? There may be some that you actually can't get rid of completely. You may be working with vulnerable people, children, inmates in a hospital, whatever it might be. There is the potential to do harm. How will you try and mediate that? How will you try and minimize that? Is the potential beneficence sufficient that it makes the small, carefully mitigated potential for harm an acceptable level? And there's almost always some risk involved in research. How can you ensure that you keep it to a low risk? Or if it is high risk, how are you going to manage that process? As I said, there actually is research being done all the time that is maleficent. So, for example, and I've got a number of examples of these, which again is in a different workshop on ethical case studies. But we have got research, we've got interesting PhD studies that are, I would argue, very bad for people and the planet. And two of the examples I can share, not from Rhodes University, I'm very pleased to tell you. The one is it's an accounting PhD, and it's looking at how multinationals can organize their finances to ensure that they don't pay taxes. Multinational corporations can organize their finances to make sure that they don't pay any taxes in any of the countries they're working in. This is a very high level, cutting edge accounting knowledge that is particularly harmful to people. Another example is an engineering PhD that looked at how to increase fracking and the way fracking is spoken about to the public so that they are not fully aware of the environmental problems associated with fracking. So it's very sad to say that you can have cutting edge knowledge that is absolutely up to date at the edges, frontiers of the field, that are problematic. So this issue of beneficence and non-maleficence is not just a theoretical one, it's a very real one. And then the fourth medical ethical principle, which I think will apply to many of your studies, is justice. Are you treating people equally and equitably? Sometimes you can't treat them all equally. Are you going to be treating them equitably then? For example, in medical research, you often have one group that is having the drug that's been tested and another group that's having the placebo. So they're not being treated equally, but you can argue how you're going to manage that equitably. I would argue that justice also comes in research that does not involve people, research that involves animals. If you are going to be maleficent, and this is often the case in animal research, where after the research the animal is actually put down, euthanized, killed, however you want to say it, can you show that you have ensured that you've treated that animal appropriately while they are being used for your research? Are you attending to all those rules? Even in fields like chemistry, there are huge issues of justice. Are you ensuring that you use the chemicals in a way that is careful and not harmful to others? Are you using chemicals that are toxic and dangerous? And are you disposing of them appropriately, and so on? So those are the four principles of medical ethics. And then there are people that argue that not all four of those are relevant to all forms of research, or perhaps they take a slightly different meaning. And so we see increasingly people saying we also need to look for authenticity, particularly in social science research, which includes education, law, commerce. Authenticity. Is the data authentic? And when I speak about positionality just now, we'll come back to this issue of authenticity, because often when you go and collect data from a community where there are big power dynamics going on, where there are political issues going on, you might be collecting data that isn't actually the authentic truth of those people that is providing it. So how are you going to ensure that the data you collect is as authentic as it can be, as real, as truthful to the experiences of your participants? Trustworthiness. How will you plan and design your research and undertake your research in a way that it can be trusted, that the readers of your research that can trust the conclusions you reach? Of course, it can be fallible. All science is fallible. And when we get new information, we can change our findings. That is the nature of science. It should be always willing to change its mind as new information becomes available. But at the time of your submitting your thesis or publishing your article, are you sufficiently sure that people can trust it? Have you designed it in a way that is trustworthy? Respect. This is a complicated one because respect evidences in very different ways in different cultural spaces. So what constitutes respect in a business meeting might look very different to what constitutes respect if you were interviewing a couple in their home. So it's not like we can just learn a set of rules about how you greet people, who speaks first, how you don't interrupt people. There aren't generic notions of what constitutes respect, but you need to think extremely carefully about what would constitute respect if you are doing research in which you are working with others. And then, of course, this question of all of these issues are about your relationship to your participants and how you will represent the data in your studies, which raises an interesting question. When I started doing research many, many, many years ago, it was more common to use the word subject. The subjects, how will you select your subjects, which is still found in certain fields. So the people that you interview or that you collect data from or that you run some kind of initiative with as part of your research, they were referred to as subjects. And then there was a move to say, but subjects is a very awful term because it objectifies them. It makes it seem like they are that they are not fully human with their own ideas and values. And we should call them participants because they are participating in the study. So there's been that move from data providers or subjects to the term participants. But increasingly now I see literature asking, but are they actually participants? To what extent are you just getting data from them, or are they actually participating in your study? To what extent do they have a say in both the ways in which they participate, the forms of data they produce? And I'm hoping that you can give that some thought, and I'm hoping that Asipe might say something just now about how she's managed this issue of ensuring that her participants are generally participating in her PhD study. So I'm going to hand over the microphone to her just now. So this is the point at which I want to ask you to put your hand up and come in and tell us, what ethical deliberations do you expect to face in your study, or are you already facing, or did you have to think through when you applied for ethical clearance? I mean, there may be many. You might, for example, talk about the ethics of how did you select your participants, or how did you choose what samples to use? You might have ethical issues around how did you manage the rights and values of your participants. You might have to, as I said earlier, have had to really reflect on accessing, protecting, and discarding toxic, poisonous, or dangerous, that's spelled wrong, materials. And of course, a myriad other ethical issues, because research is always, regardless of what kind of research you do, it always involves ethical issues. So it's at this point that I'm finally going to shut up for a while and ask you to think what you would like to share or ask a question. If you have any ethical concerns or if you've reflected deeply on some aspect, I'm really hoping that you'll share your viewpoints. And while you are summoning your thoughts and mustering your courage to put up your hand, I'm going to ask Asipe, is Asipe here? Is Asipe CPGS? Yes.
Hi, Sue. Yes, I am.
Great. Asipe, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you first to share your ethical deliberations about this idea of participants.
Okay. Just a bit of a background. I'm looking at student experiences of gender in higher education, post, mass fall, during or after COVID. So the methodology that I'm using is narratives. I looked at the conversations between myself and my collaborators. Before going to the field, I struggled with the idea of participants because it felt like I am inviting people to participate in something that I own, which is quite generally what research ought to be, but I wanted to do it differently. So I made use of this idea of collaborating. So from my methodology, I collaborated with people who shared their stories, people being students in Eastern Cape universities who shared their story. In the conversation and in the field, one important thing that I made sure I did was to let them own their stories. So what I term as ukuncokola, which is conversation, in those conversations, they owned the way in which they told their stories, where they wanted to tell their stories, meeting place, and how they wanted to tell their stories. So some of my collaborators submitted pitches, others wanted a conversation online, others a conversation face-to-face, but the most important thing was for the collaborators to own their story. And that meant that even in the preparation of the conversation question that I wanted to ask, it had to be one, and thereafter it becomes a fluent conversation. So one thing that I did in order for me to do that and to get my participant to actually feel confident and trust me to handle their stories with grace was to actually get to know them more and then have conversations after conversations. Of course, some of you will think, how do you then balance, the conversation that will lead to your story to your study, as well as wasting your time and resources and listening to some stories. So what I did was, in the first session, as I'm getting to know them, they usually jump into the conversation because they've received the document. But then the second time, I draft questions based on our conversation for clarity so that those can add back to my study. So that we usually call a follow-up. So yeah, and most important thing, negotiating your power in this space. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that you certainly, really engaged in deep reflection in making those decisions. By the way, if what you found, if what Asipe presented is interesting to you, relevant to your own study, I really recommend getting in touch with her. But I also really recommend reading Corinne Knowles' PhD. She just graduated last year. Corinne Knowles, she works in the Extended Studies Unit in Churchill, because her PhD really engages at length in this issue of interaction with people as part of your study. Right, let's hear from you. Any questions, comments? I'd love to. Let's try and have a chat about ethical issues that have been troubling you, or that you've been thinking about, and you've got something to share. I can see there's some questions here, so let me engage with those. in the chat bar. Zanele is saying, okay, interesting, the last one. Can you clarify the difference between actual participants and data providers? Well, it's the same thing in terms of who it would be. It's a different ideological position because participants are people who participate, so they are actively involved. And Asipe actually said she talks about collaborators because they are creating the knowledge with her. And so that's a different term. And data providers is pretty much like the term subjects. It's the people that are, so the relationship is definitely more, what can we say, more unbalanced, where they are more passive. You just ask them to fill in a survey or to answer some very set interview questions. You've got your data and you leave. They're not engaged in more equitable ways. Zanele, I don't know. I often find it hard to find the hand action. It's actually under the, now I can't find it myself. Anyway, if you have something to say, just unmute yourself. Let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Sue, for the workshop. What's this? The ethics components that you just spoke of, they were just interesting because I never thought of any of or some of them. So as I reflected, okay, I have not reflected towards the study I'm going to do, but maybe on the previous studies, the studies that I have done, just issues about whether the students that or the graduates that I was getting information from, whether they were really actual participants, whether, okay, I really do believe that they were data providers, but I'm just not so sure if they were participating or collaborating, or maybe I was extracting from them what I wanted to hear. So that was really interesting to really think about, and really about authenticity. Okay, I want to say it.
Wonderful word. Yes,
Yes. Yeah, about how I wrote my results, if it was really truthful, or was I, putting what I wanted to get out. So that was just interesting. So my question is really on the POPIA Act, on research. What entails that? Yeah, because I found it very difficult when I was doing my study. The institutions would just be talking about the POPIA Act, and I understood it in a different way. So maybe just clarity on that.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that question. The POPIA Act, there is actually a research statement on the POPIA Act, which was put together by Universities South Africa. I'm going to ask Asipe and Olwe to include that when they send out the email, so that you can have a look, because that's been written by a group of researchers who've tried to say, well, this legislation, what does it mean for us in our research? And I think that's quite helpful. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around the POPIA Act, and it can cause all sorts of hurdles for researchers, and in ways that are almost unethical, because they stop good research from happening because of concerns around privacy. It's very important, of course, to consider very carefully the extent how you will select your participants, so that they know, but why are you approaching me? Can you justify that? And that's in a way where the POPIA Act comes in, because where did you get their details? Most of that information in the POPIA Act in its original form is more about spam calling. It doesn't seem to have stopped spam calling. I still get so many phone calls. Hello, is that Sue McKenna? Thank you for taking my call. Oh no, they always say, first of all, how are you doing today? And the POPIA Act, yes, I was constantly saying it's POPIA is with the word act on the end. You're quite right. POPIA Act is mainly talks about that you can't just spam call people. You need to be able to give a good reason for where did you get their phone number from and why are you phoning them. But that, of course, is relevant for research. Why are you approaching those people to be in your sample? On what basis? Have you got a clear rationale that is equitable and just? And this is important because, for example, if I have a look at communities that are over-researched, so, for example, we might say, oh, we're going to do some research on the staff members at Rhodes University. We're doing research on attitudes towards abortion. We're doing another research project on alcohol usage. We're doing another research project on back problems. So we're doing all these different research projects, and we're going to choose Rhodes University staff as the sample. It is not unusual for those studies to often include the grades 1, 2, 3, 4 as their sample. Now, grades 1, 2, 3, 4 will be the people who do gardens and grounds, cooking, catering, security. And it's important to note, but why are you focusing on that group? Is there an assumption about that group in relation to the topic? Can you justify that? Is it because that group is more likely to agree to participate than professors and vice chancellors? So it's those kind of issues to really think through, and POPI Act sort of speaks to that. POPI Act also speaks very strongly to the need for anonymity in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases. And people often think that making your participants anonymous means giving them a pseudonym or just not using their name. But I would argue that you need to be very careful, because if you say, interview with participant X, who is the dean of science at Wits University, or the dean of science, but I know your studies at Wits University, well, I just have to Google to find out who that person is. So it's not just about their name, it's all identifying characteristics have to be deleted from your data. And sometimes you want to say that this was the dean of science because the claim you're making about what that person said is pertinent to their position as dean and to their faculty of science. So you've got to think very carefully about anonymizing characteristics and what you will and won't do. Another example I can give you that the POPI Act makes very clear is around when do you identify or withhold the identity of organizations. And I examined a PhD a few years ago that had that was an anonymous private higher education institution in the Western Cape. Now, there are many private higher education institutions in the Western Cape, so that's fine. They also said very clearly that they'd promised the institution that they would anonymize it. So that was a condition of collecting the data. They also said that this particular institution was in the field of web design, graphics, and so on. Now, as it happens, there is about 10 private higher education institutions in the Western Cape that are focused on that. So fine, it's still anonymized. But later in the PhD, they quote the mission statement of that university. I just put the mission statement into Google and I was able to see what institution it is. So often I think people try and do a compliance thing around anonymity, and they don't really take it seriously as an ethical consideration. Doesn't mean you have to keep people anonymous. POPI doesn't ask for that. POPI can indeed allows for you to use people's names with their permission, and sometimes people want to be used. But you need to think very carefully then, if you're going to use people's actual identities or institutions' actual identities, what might the risk factors be, the potential implications. Yeah, Simpiwe says, what extent do you have to request participants to partake in your research? It has to be voluntary. It is very rare that you can undertake research where it is covert, which basically means that you're collecting data without people's knowledge. It would be very unusual. I have got an example of that, which is looking at ghost writing organizations where data was collected from these organizations. So these are organizations that they're often called ghost writing organizations or paper mills. They sell assignments and theses to students. And that one, the study was covert. So the researcher was pretending to be a student and interacting with these organizations in order to collect data, and that was granted permission. But it would be very unusual to get permission to do covert data. Getting informed consent is an absolutely fundamental part of doing ethical research. It's a rare case that you can't. If your participant is unable to give informed consent because they don't have the mental capacity to do so, or because they're a child, then you often have to get consent from a parent or guardian. So giving informed consent, requires you to be able to give consent. There's thinking nowadays that if you're going to do research with children, getting informed consent from parents is essential, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get informed consent from the children. Even a 2-year-old certainly not going to be able to sign a fancy informed consent form that the parents might need to sign, but even a 2-year-old, you can at least make sure that they are happy to participate, that they understand at least in part what this is all about. So informed consent is not just about the POPI Act, it's also just really about ethical research. It's a bit different to the gatekeeping letters, and there will be a workshop on gatekeeping letters later in the year. Gatekeeping letters are when, let's say, I want to go and do research at Rhodes University, I want to interview students. I can't just walk up to students and say, can I interview you? I have to first get permission from the registrar to say, this is my study, this is my ethical clearance, this is how I'm going to do it. And she will make sure that, yes, indeed, this is not going to bring harm to students. And only when I've had that gatekeeper's permission may I then approach students. But then, of course, the students have complete right to say, no, thanks, I don't want to be in your study. And they can only give permission to be in the study if they are fully informed. So gatekeepers is a separate issue. And there are occasions where gatekeepers' letters are not required. And an example of that is a study that was done at Rhodes University looking at farm workers and how they were treated. And initially there was a view that, well, if you speak to farm workers, you need to get permission, and you're speaking to them about their work environment, you need to get permission from their boss, from the farmer. And the researcher quite rightly said, that will undermine my entire study, because no farmer who's treating the farm workers badly is going to give permission for that study. And the farm workers, if they know that the farmer has said that they can do the study, is going to imagine that they need to give responses according to what may please their boss. So these are all careful considerations to be taken into account. Let's have another question before we move on, or another comment, or something you have confronted in your own studies. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone's hand. I'm hoping that's because you don't have any ethical deliberations and everything is sorted, and not because you're feeling too shy to unmute yourself. Please do just unmute yourself at any time if you want to add something. Oh, Simpiwe, tell me, unmute yourself. Let's hear from Simpiwe. This looks interesting. Are you able to unmute yourself and to chat?
Hi, colleagues.
Yes, good. Can hear you.
Yes, it's POA. No, currently my own issue, it's the project I'm doing is around the joint venture partnerships. Now the issue is in the joint venture partnerships, there are agribusiness and commercial farmers and the workers' trust who form part into the joint venture. Now I'm interested in interviewing the workers' trust themselves, because in the shareholding agreements, the workers' trust, they have 51%, and then the agribusiness or commercial farmers, they have 49%. Now I'm interested now to get information on the side of the workers' trust, so as to assess as to whether they can recommend to government that the policy on joint ventures can be taken further, even to other provinces, because my study is based in the Eastern Cape. So up to now, we have been begging to get access to that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds like a really, I want to say a nice ethical challenge, but it's not nice for you, I'm sure, but very interesting one. I think that I don't know enough about the particular group of people, but it's very true that you will often get resistance to participation, and you can't override that resistance. You can't suddenly just start getting covert data or, getting collecting data without voluntary informed consent. But there are means of working with people to build that trust. And definitely Asipe spoke a lot about that in her own PhD. She, how do you build trust? There used to be an idea that the first thing you do in an interview is get the informed consent form signed. And that I found quite problematic, because why would I sign a form, even if you talk me through the form and you make it clear it's all about my rights and it's about the voluntary nature, my right to withdraw and all of that? It still feels like it's some kind of contract. And I don't even know you, dude. And now you want me to sign this contract before I give you my information? And so I think there's an increasing understanding that you need to spend quite a bit of time building trust in who you are and what your agenda is. And that might entail a number of meetings that don't produce data, a number of conversations that are not part of your study, that can be quite time consuming, but they are necessary to build sufficient trust with your participants to then be able to begin the more formal process of informed consent and the actual data collection. And that can be frustrating, because often as those conversations become quite collegial, people start saying things and you think, hang on, I want to catch this as my data. Which of course you can do if you've got such a good relationship. By then you can kind of jokingly say that. But it does mean that you have to expend more time. And as I say, I think ethics committees are starting to understand that this is often a necessary part prior to data collection. And this is particularly true of vulnerable groups or groups that may assume that you have a particular agenda. And that really need to spend time with you as a person before they are convinced that, and I hope what I'm about to say is true, they are convinced that you are genuinely trying to understand their experiences and their perspectives. You are not there to try and ascribe any particular assumptions or views. You are not there to impose any. You have an open mind and you are willing to genuinely hear from them. And it can take a while to get people to believe that and to understand that. Sometimes what happens is that once you've managed to achieve that with one participant, you can have a kind of snowball effect, that they say, oh, you know what, you should agree to go and be part of Simpiwe's study, because actually he was really cool and he really listened to me and it was quite good to talk about this stuff. And so you have what's called snowball sampling, where they will, and you can end an interview by saying, have you got friends who might also meet these criteria, the study criteria? I'd really like to hear from as many people as you. So can you advise anyone that I might approach, or that you might approach and ask if they would be willing to participate in my study? So I don't have a nice, neat answer for you. I just have sympathy, because I know this can take time. And sometimes, worst case scenario, you actually have to redesign your study when it becomes clear that you are not going to be able to access certain forms of data that you had hoped to access. That does happen. Okay, I'm going to move along just because I'm so very aware of time suddenly. Positionality is increasingly being required to be addressed in your proposals and in your ethical clearance forms. And this is the idea that you are always in your research. Now, in very objective natural science research, it might be that you are doing experiments in a laboratory and you say, well, I'm not really in this research in the terms of my identity, my values, my religion, my beliefs, my assumptions, my biases, because I'm just doing this experiment. But even there, some would argue that all knowledge is political, all knowledge is ideological, and therefore all research is political and ideological, because it's a human being making choices, and human beings are notoriously biased, prejudiced, fallible. But certainly in the more social science research, then positionality is very clearly important. Who are you in the research? What are your identities, prejudices, blind spots, limitations of knowledge going to mean for your study? So I want to ask you to do a quick activity. I'm going to turn on my camera. If you wouldn't mind just having a look at me So I am Professor Sue McKenna. I'm the director of the Centre for Postgraduate Studies at Rhodes University, and I would like to interview you about your experiences at Rhodes University. What I'd like you to do, and I'd like you to be as bold and brave and crude and rude as you like, is in the chat bar, tell me what identities you are giving to me. So let's say that's all I said. I arrive, I say I'm Sue McKenna, Professor Sue McKenna, Rhodes University, Centre for Postgraduate Studies. I'd like to interview you about your experiences. Have a look at me. What do you see? What do you notice? And what might some of your assumptions be, or perhaps that you think some other students who I approach, doesn't have to be what you think you would think. What do you think some other students might think if I approach them, saying what I have just said? So let's hear in the chat column, what do you see when you see me as a researcher coming to interview you? Do not be shy. I will not be hurt. I want to hear your honest views. Olwetu and Asipe, I'm going to ask you to put your comments in the chat bar and get people started, because maybe when they see what you say, pretending that you don't know me, that you only heard what I've just said, what would you think? What do you see? I'm hoping if you start us off, others will join the chat. Okay, thanks, Zanella, for getting us going. The rest of you keep typing. Because, you know, I know you're well-researched, stating you're a prof, I'd probably think of saying something positive. Okay, well, that's great. Personally, I find the title professor can be quite off-putting. So I often wouldn't use my title if I was doing research. Now, Zanella is saying, oh, you know, it would be positive. Oh, this is a professor, you know, they must know what they're doing. But I think sometimes professor can mean like, well, I'm much more important than you. I know a lot more than you. And it might serve, these are just things to think about, it might serve, using your title might serve to actually make the person feel a bit vulnerable, a bit scared of saying the wrong thing. Exactly as Lesego says, intimidating. A title can be intimidating. Even saying that you're at Rhodes University can be intimidating, you know, depending on what group you're working with. So we need to think of the power dynamics. We need to think of how I'm not suggesting we lie. I'm not suggesting we say that we're someone we're not, but I'm suggesting think about how you approach yourself. It's all about power dynamics. Fatima says, you know, I'd be worried about sounding a bit foolish. Pendile says, why are you approaching me? You know, like, what have I done wrong? Or, you know, if I just walk up to you in the quad and say, hello, I'm Professor Sansa, you know, you've got to think about how that first impression can actually make people feel a bit nervous. Someone has posted privately to me, I think, a very important quote. So I will say what they've said. And that is, oh, I can't see it now. And that is, well, I've got to think about why a white woman is doing this research. So if it's research on, and the example that person gave is people of color, why is this white woman doing this research? And race is a big consideration. Age is a consideration. Gender is a consideration. Your body language is a consideration. Are you the right person to collect this data? So, you know, would you be intimidating? An example of this was a PhD that I read many years ago, not at Rhodes University again, I can tell you, but it was a principal of a school, and he was doing his PhD on teenage pregnancy, and he was interviewing schoolgirls in his own school who had fallen pregnant. And he just, now maybe that would be possible if he put in place all sorts of ethical considerations, but he didn't seem aware of that. He kept saying, no, but they'll tell me the truth. No, of course they must. And it was a very problematic proposal, and it ended up being a very problematic PhD. Susan's raised a really important point. I see you as holding a high position at Rhodes. So you're going to want me to say good things at Rhodes. I'm going to feel uncomfortable to share my views because of your position. You know, you're going to be knowledgeable. What if I share things that aren't important? These are all important things to consider. And you're doing it about me, Sue McKenna, but bear in mind that you may well be intimidating to the people you're researching. Now, I want to point out that sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes you are interviewing people who hold more status, given the weird way in which status is given out in society. And so you might find yourself being intimidated, and you actually really have to pluck up the courage to be confident and comfortable when you're interviewing the vice chancellor or the CEO of a company or whatever. So that's also an ethical issue where the power dynamic works in the opposite way around, is to really think through how will you manage that power dynamic in a way that'll ensure you get authentic knowledge and authentic information. And sometimes that might mean changing your research design. Simpiwe makes an important point here. I'd feel nervous at first, but feel comfortable as we go along. So even if you get it all right in terms of how you present yourself, how you interact with the person, probably they are going to feel nervous, but hopefully your manner will make them feel comfortable. Many novice researchers feel very anxious when they're doing their interviews. It's like, I've got to get this right. It's high stakes. They are the ones that are nervous, not the person being interviewed. And this can actually be a real problem because it means that it doesn't feel comfortable. And Asipe talked about the idea of an interview as a conversation where it's not actually a set of questions. It's just people talking to each other. Even if you are doing a more formal interview, you want to make it a space where the person feels comfortable enough in your presence to give you authentic data, authentic in that it's their truth. Okay, Rachel, you want me to move along? Quite right. I am going to do that. So the use of AI, we are going to end on that, but importantly, I want to say two things about AI. Firstly, in that last bullet, Neil is running an AI session on Elicit on the 20th. And that is a hands-on session where he will show you how to use Elicit. If you don't know Elicit, you can start playing with it already. There are many versions like Elicit. Elicit's just one brand name. Researcher Rabbit is another one. I find Elicit very useful. It's an AI tool that'll allow you to access literature, summarize literature, compare different methods, different sample sizes, and so on and so forth. So that's a hands-on session on Elicit, on the use of AI, which I highly recommend. The link at the top there is a link, and I'm going to very quickly share the link to share screen, the link, the document that has been produced by EdTech at Rhodes University, and you will find, why is it that I can never find things when I'm in a hurry now? Okay, let's just quickly share this. That's Elicit. This is the document that you'll find at that link, which is about students, whether undergraduate or postgraduate, using AI, and it's got really good examples. It discusses many of the ethical issues, and it discusses some of the examples of AI that you might like to try and use. Here's the ethical issues. So again, we're going to make sure that you get the copy of this, and I would strongly recommend that you work through it. One of the important comments that is made in that document is that you really need to understand how AI works if you're going to use generative artificial intelligence like ChatGPT or any of the researcher AI or any of the visual AIs. And what you need to understand is that it does not think. It does not tell you the truth. It does not tell you the lie. All it does is it uses machine learning on the basis of this enormous corpus of data, corpus of documents and visuals and so on, to, in reply to your prompts, give you the next most likely word, sentence, paragraph. Based on, it is able to rapidly make sense of all these billions of documents and say, right, when people are talking about this is the most likely, and it will produce a brand new text. It's never been written before, but based on the formula of patterns in its corpus of knowledge. And this means that it may well do what's known in the literature as hallucinations, or also known as botshit, which is where it puts together words and even references that are entirely made up because it recognizes that formula in all the previous texts it's looked at. So it can make up whole references, it can make up facts that are completely untrue, because it is not thinking, it is not telling you the truth, it is not telling you a lie. It is simply generating sentences on the basis of its masses of data in response to the prompt you have given it. So the better your prompt and the better your understanding of how AI works, the less likely you're going to have to worry about hallucinations and botshit. So if you, those are just two terms for the same thing. I actually prefer the term botshit because it shows you, it really tells you what it is, whereas hallucinations makes you think it's like a person that can hallucinate things. It's not a person. But importantly, it works really well if you are asking it to improve your writing, or if you're really bad at writing and you say, these are the bullets I want to include in a paragraph, please turn this into a paragraph for me, and then you edit it. It's fantastic for that. But then you are owning the content. Whereas if you just ask it to answer a question, bear in mind, it may give you a very useful answer, but it is doing that based on the patterns in all the previous data, not on the truth or a lie. And because it's based on human-produced data, it has biases and blind spots. And there's been lots of evidence of people using AI and not being aware that it has the same sexism and racism that we find in all the data that's in its databases. And the transformative power of knowledge creation. When you create knowledge, you own that knowledge in your head. No one can take that away from you. You have made sense of the conversations at the frontiers of the field. You have undertaken empirical research. You have produced new knowledge. Don't hand that over to an AI. Use the AI to help you find good texts, help you write better, by all means. But the transformative power of knowledge is a human attribute, and one that we really hope all our postgraduates will hold. Rachel asks a question, does it steal ideas, mine, for examples, if I enter my writing into the system? The answer is yes and no. Yes, anything you put into an AI gets added to this enormous corpus of data. So if you put in something, it is now part of that corpus of data. But it doesn't work in terms of it doesn't work like Google search. If someone now went into ChatGPT and asked for your research question, it's not going to necessarily find that. It's going to look through the billions of data, including what you've added to it. But that is a real issue that you raised, Rachel, because there have been examples of people learning how to, people putting in coding and company secrets and AI being hacked by their competitors and being able to then get that data. So it's not the AI then that shares that data, but hackers have been able to get in. And that is why many companies are making very clear to their staff members that they cannot put anything that is a company secret into AI. And I guess the same would be true of your research. And Zanella asks, using Elicit, will it help us to learn to read articles? It'll summarize those articles. Yes, indeed, it summarizes those articles. But once again, it is not a human being. It is AI. So it will summarize it in its I don't want to say understanding, but in its programming of not just that article you've asked it to summarize, but of its programming of how all articles work. So it produces, I think, really good summaries, but don't now just quote on the basis of what the summary said. The summary can be useful to help you decide, more than what the abstract said. Is this something I want to read further? But in the end, you want to quote from what the human being said and not base it on the summary, because the summary can get it wrong. it's unlikely to make up stuff in illicit because it will just give you a summary of what's in the text, but it might miss a key point or it might overemphasize a fairly minor point. And it's really a human being that helps you to understand the distinction there. But the other good thing illicit can do, which you will learn about from Neil on the 20th, is that if for those of you who are trying to do like comparative studies, or you only want to read literature that has samples of more than 50 people, or you only want to read the literature that's on this topic using this technology, it will be able to do those very complex searches and be able to map out that literature for you. I'm over time as always. I hope that some of that was useful. I think the bottom line is let's be really reflective, ethical people who do our best to contribute to knowledge in meaningful ways. Please remember to fill in the evaluation. It helps us to do better next time and to figure out what you need more of. Keep well, everyone. Take care and bye-bye.